She dismissed him as just another customer, only to realize too late that he owned the place. And worse, he was Clint Eastwood. The midday sun poured through the wide windows of Sierra Grill, a modest yet popular restaurant in Carmel by the Sea, California. It wasn't high-end, but it had its charm, a blend of rustic warmth and modern simplicity. The kind of place locals loved, especially on a warm Thursday afternoon. For Megan, a 23-year-old waitress juggling bills and long shifts, charm wasn't enough to ease her frustration. From the moment she clocked in, it had been chaos. "Table 7 needs extra dressing," a fellow server called. Megan barely looked up, scrawling another order onto her notepad as she weaved through the packed restaurant. Complaints about undercooked steaks, split checks, and missing drinks piled up. Worse, 3 separate customers had stiffed her on tips, leaving behind nothing but a few coins. So when an elderly man quietly took a seat at a corner table, Megan was already on edge. He looked like someone who didn't care much for appearances. Slightly wrinkled flannel shirt, faded jeans, and a well-worn Stetson resting on the table. His boots looked like they'd seen their fair share of dirt roads. Megan gave him a quick once-over, her lips curling in a faint smirk. "Great," she muttered under her breath. "Another one who'll order a coffee and leave me $1." Still, she couldn't avoid him forever. Her coworker nudged her. "You've got table 12. Megan sighed, grabbed her notepad, and put on her best, fake smile as she approached. "What can I get you today?" she asked, her tone teetering on impatience. The man looked up, sharp eyes scanning her face. Something about him felt familiar. "Just a burger," he said, his voice low and gravelly, steady, in a way that commanded quiet respect. "Burger, got it. Anything else?" Megan tapped her pen against her notepad, already half distracted. "No, ma'am," he replied, tipping his hat slightly. She barely held back an eye roll. "Ma'am? Really?" she muttered under her breath as she walked off. But as she disappeared into the kitchen, something about him lingered in her thoughts. Unlike the other customers, loud, demanding, impatient, he was different. There was a quiet confidence in the way he sat, like he was watching and waiting for something. Megan shook it off. Just another table, another order, another lousy tip. A few minutes later, she returned with the burger. The plate clattered onto the table with a little less care than usual. "Here you go," she said, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face as she dropped the ketchup bottle beside his plate. "Anything else?" The man studied the burger, then looked back at her. "No. This looks just fine, thank you." His words were polite, but there was something firm in his tone, something that made Megan feel oddly self-conscious. She lingered for a second. Why wasn't she walking away? Something about him annoyed her. Maybe it was the way he seemed so unaffected. While the rest of the restaurant buzzed with noise, complaints, snapping fingers, hurried footsteps, he just sat there, calm, unshaken. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked, leaning against the table. "No, I'm not," he replied, cutting his burger in half with precise, deliberate movements. Megan smirked. "Thought so. The hat gave it away. Looks like you just stepped out of an old Western movie." For the first time, the man smiled. Not a full grin, just a slight knowing curve of his lips. "Something like that," he said. Megan had expected annoyance, maybe even defensiveness. Instead, he stayed calm. That frustrated her even more. She was tired of being polite, tired of holding back. "You know," she said, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret, "most people around here don't show up looking like they just came from a ranch." The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a slow, measured bite of his burger. Then, after a moment, he simply said, "I guess I'm not most people." His words were simple, but they carried a weight Megan hadn't expected. For the first time, she felt out of place. A flicker of embarrassment crept in, but she quickly buried it. "Well, enjoy your meal," she said, pushing herself off the table before he could say anything else. She was sure she had gotten the last word. But as she cleared a nearby table, she felt his eyes on her, watching. That look he gave her, It wasn't threatening or condescending, but it made Megan feel like she was being evaluated, judged even. Something about it unsettled her, though she couldn't quite say why. And yet, that brief moment, his quiet observation, would soon change the course of her day and her life. As the lunch rush died down, the restaurant quieted. Megan finally had a moment to breathe. Leaning against the counter, she absent-mindedly scrolled through her phone, keeping one eye on her tables. Her gaze flicked to table 12. The man was finishing his meal, unhurried, sipping his water while glancing around the restaurant with quiet interest. "Hey, Megan," her coworker Danny said, passing by. "Isn't it weird how calm that guy is? Like he's just taking it all in?" Megan shrugged. "Some people have all the time in the world." Danny chuckled. "Maybe he's famous or something. He looks familiar, doesn't he?" Megan rolled her eyes. "Famous? Yeah, right. If he's famous, then I'm the Queen of England." Danny raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Megan wasn't in the mood for pointless speculation. Instead, she grabbed the check for table 12 and strode over, determined to keep the exchange brief. "Here's your check," she said, placing it on the table with a faint smile. "Whenever you're ready." The man glanced at the check but didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, he looked up, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. "Do you enjoy your job?" he asked. His voice was calm but deliberate. The question caught Megan off guard. She hesitated. Her practiced smile faltered. "It's fine," she said with a shrug. "It's a job, you know?" He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "A job's what you make of it," he said. Then, after a beat, "But it seems like you're carrying a lot today." Megan felt her cheeks flush. Who was he to comment on her attitude? She crossed her arms. "Look, I've had a rough shift, okay? Not everyone gets to sit around eating burgers and handing out life advice." To her surprise, the man didn't seem offended. Instead, he leaned back slightly, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Fair enough," he said. "But sometimes how you treat people in those moments says more about you than you think." A flicker of irritation rose in Megan's chest. Was he lecturing her? She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, he stood up, pulled out his wallet, and set a few bills on the table. "I'll leave you with that thought," he said. "Thanks for the meal." As he walked toward the exit, Megan muttered under her breath, "Yeah, whatever, cowboy." But then, something unexpected happened. Her manager, Carol, a no-nonsense woman who rarely showed much excitement, suddenly hurried out from the back. Her face lit up the moment she saw him. "Mr. Eastwood, I wasn't expecting you today," she said, extending her hand enthusiastically. Megan froze. Her stomach dropped. The name replayed in her head like an echo. Eastwood. Clint Eastwood. Her head snapped toward the door, her pulse hammering. The man, Clint Eastwood, turned slightly, shaking Carol's hand with a polite nod. For just a moment, his eyes met Megan's again. A knowing look passed between them. And then he was gone. Megan stood there, stunned. She hadn't just been short with some unassuming customer. She had just brushed off Clint Eastwood. Clint Eastwood. And not only that, he owned the restaurant. Her grip tightened around her notepad, her heart pounding as Carol turned to her with a bright smile. "Megan," Carol called, waving her over. "Can you believe it? Mr. Eastwood stopped by today. He's been so busy lately, I haven't seen him in weeks." Megan forced a nod, her throat dry. Yeah. That's... Wow." Carol didn't seem to notice her distress, too caught up in her excitement. "You know, this place means the world. To him. He's so hands-on, every little detail here is something he personally approved. That's why we always remind staff to bring their best. You never know when he'll stop by." Megan felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Her mind replayed every word she'd said to him, every eye roll, every snarky remark, every moment of impatience. Her cheeks burned. "You okay?" Danny asked, noticing her pale face. Megan swallowed hard. I think I need a minute." Without another word, she turned and walked toward the break room. The moment the door shut behind her, she sank into a chair, letting out a shaky breath. How had she been so oblivious? 2 years at Sierra Grill, and not once had she paid attention to the stories about its mysterious owner. If she had, maybe she would have recognized him, or at the very least, thought twice before running her mouth. Her mind spun, replaying every snarky remark, every dismissive look, but one thought stood out above the rest. What now? Little did Megan know. Clint Eastwood wasn't done with her just yet. The next day, Megan walked into work with a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She hadn't slept well. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, that calm, unreadable expression, the way he had looked at her as he left. And she cringed. What if he had told Carol about her attitude? What if she got fired? Rent was due in 2 weeks. Her student loans weren't going to pay themselves. She couldn't afford to lose this job. So she spent the first half of her shift avoiding eye contact with Carol, pouring every ounce of energy into being the perfect employee, smiling, apologizing, refilling drinks before anyone even had to ask. It was the most effort she had put into this job in months. By lunchtime, the restaurant was in full swing, the hum of conversation filling the air. Megan was wiping down a table when a voice cut through the noise. A voice she hadn't been able to forget. "Looks like you're busy today." She turned sharply. Standing near the counter, hands casually resting in his pockets, was Clint Eastwood. Her heart sank. He was dressed much the same as the day before, but this time, his presence felt even more commanding. Megan forced a nervous smile, her mind scrambling for words. "Mr. Eastwood, hi. I didn't know you'd be back so soon." He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I like to check in on my places from time to time," he said. "Keeps everyone on their toes." Megan swallowed hard, her palms suddenly damp. "Right. Well, everything's running great today." Clint glanced around the restaurant, then back at her. "I see that. But you seem a little tense." She froze. Of course he noticed. He probably noticed everything. About yesterday." He lifted a hand, cutting her off. "No need to apologize," he said calmly. "I'm not here to make your life harder." She blinked, caught off guard. "You're not?" "No." His voice was steady but firm. "But I do think there's a lesson here." Megan braced herself. "You never know who you're talking to or what they might be going through." He held her gaze. "A little kindness goes a long way." Her throat tightened. She didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded, a lump forming in her chest. "Look, I've had bad days too," Clint continued, his tone softening. "But the way you handle those days says a lot about who you are. And trust me, people notice." Megan felt her face flush. His words weren't harsh, but they hit harder than any scolding ever could, because he wasn't trying to embarrass her. He was trying to teach her something. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I mean it." A small smile crossed Clint's face. "You're welcome. Just remember, every interaction's an opportunity. Use it well." And with that, he tipped his hat and walked out, leaving Megan standing there, overwhelmed, with a mix of emotions, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something unexpected, the desire to be better. Over the next few weeks, Megan couldn't shake Clint's words. They played on repeat in her mind every time she stepped onto the restaurant floor. Every interaction's an opportunity, use it well. At first, she didn't know where to start. She wasn't the type to flash fake smiles or gush over customers like some of her coworkers did. But Clint's quiet wisdom had struck a chord. She didn't have to pretend to be someone she wasn't. She just needed to be better. So she started small. When a frazzled mom with 3 kids knocked over a soda, Megan didn't sigh or roll her eyes. Instead, she grabbed a rag, smiled, and said, "Don't worry, It happens to the best of us. When an elderly couple asked her to repeat the specials 3 times, she didn't let her frustration show. She patiently explained them again, even adding her own recommendations. And the thing that surprised her most? The more effort she put into treating people kindly, the better she felt. One evening, near the end of her shift, Carol called Megan into the office. Megan's stomach twisted. Had Clint said something after all? Was this it? Her hands felt clammy. As she stepped inside, Carol folded her hands on the desk, studying her for a moment. "You've been working here for a while," she said. Megan nodded, bracing herself. "And I've noticed a change in you lately." She paused. Then, Carol smiled. "Good one," Megan blinked. Megan hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Oh, thank you." She paused, then added, "I don't know what brought it on." Carol smiled. "Whatever it is, keep it up. The customers have noticed too. One even left a comment card the other day praising your service." Megan felt something unexpected, a swell of pride, and maybe a little disbelief. She hadn't expected anyone to notice her efforts, let alone acknowledge them. As she left the office, a small smile tugged at her lips. She still had a long way to go. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. That night, as she locked up the restaurant, she glanced at the sign out front. This wasn't just a job anymore, it was a place where she could grow, a place where she could learn, maybe even a place where she could make a difference. And she owed it all to the quiet cowboy who had walked in one busy afternoon and taught her a lesson she'd never forget. Because sometimes, the smallest interactions have the biggest impact, and every moment is a chance to become someone better. If this story inspired you, hit the like button and share it with someone who could use a little encouragement. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life lessons and stories that remind us all to be a little kinder every day.